Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabarty. Today is Thursday, May 2nd, and we have a couple NBA games to dive into from last night, some playoffs where we saw the Mavericks take a pivotal Game 5 to retake the series advantage. We saw the Celtics move on to the second round, both of those wins coming in dominant fashion. So we're going to sort of break both of those down. And then we've been hammering a lot of NBA action lately, but in the second half of the show, we're going to be talking some NFL, where I wanted to look at the NFC North because they have put together quite an impressive offseason, really from all the teams as a whole. I think it is a handful of younger teams that are continuing to build up for the future. So I think there's a lot of promise there. I want to sort of dive into that conversation. And then finally, for the final segment of the show, we're going to be talking about some of the wide receiver trade rumors. We've had some development specifically along the lines of T. Higgins, but there is also this Brandon Ayuk situation that is sort of hanging out there. And I don't know if we fully touched on it since the beginning of the NFL draft. So we are going to be diving into all of that. But before we do get into the show today, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. For our live viewers and for our commenters after the fact, be sure to use the comment section to give us your thoughts on the latest happenings in sports. Try and make the show as interactive as possible. And if you would consider leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker throughout the show. That is gsmcpodcast.net. Anything would be greatly appreciated. First game that we are going to be diving into from last night is the Dallas Mavericks and LA Clippers, where it looked like we were going to have a competitive game on our hands. We'll get into the Celtics Heat a little bit later in the show, but that was the first game of the night, and that was very uncompetitive. So it was a little refreshing seeing the back and forth going on between the Mavericks and the Clippers through the first half. But ultimately, the Mavericks just ended up demolishing the Clippers in that second half. They end up winning by 30 points, 123-93. The Mavericks lead was 10 at halftime, and the Clippers were in it. But it did seem like in that second quarter, the Mavericks were really building on something defensively, and they were locked in, and that ended up being the case where they were just able to pull away. They held both Paul George and James Harden to very ineffective nights, thanks to the likes of PJ Washington and Derrick Jones Jr., who were both tremendous in this game in my eyes. I actually didn't even realize that PJ Washington was 1 of 7 from the field offensively until this morning when I went back and looked at the box score, because of the fact that it felt like he was still making an impact. So obviously in the long term, they are going to want him to provide some more offense, but he played his role last night and he did exactly what they needed him to do. You saw he was picking up some of these ball handlers for LA all the way the length of the court. And again, eventually they're going to want more offense from him. I still think he's had a good series as a whole, but last night still finding a way to be impactful without scoring. And that was really the story for all of their key players, including Kyrie Irving, who had a down night in terms of his averages, scored 14 points, but he was also really impactful, diving on the ground for loose balls, and he was helping to run the court, set up his teammates, all of the above. So I thought that the Mavericks really had a convincing performance last night, and it was built off of the defense that they played, and they have been a very solid defensive team. There was that stretch right directly following the All-Star break where they definitely were struggling at that point, but since then they have been one of the best defensive units in the league. They are top 5 in terms of defensive rating post All-Star break. Big boss Andrew Tate at the company, he gave a stat in a production meeting earlier today that they are the number one defensive team since the beginning of March, I believe. So you're going to have to take his word for that. I haven't had time to double check that, but the eye test would back that up because they have been really incredible on that side of the ball. And this is what is sort of taking them from the fun team that they were to a legitimate, dark horse finals contender. And I've been on the Mavericks really since they made their moves at the trade deadline. I know that it was a little polarizing. They did give up a lot in order to go get PJ Washington, specifically that pick. I believe it's in 2029, that if this were to fully fall by the wayside, that could end up being a very valuable pick. But as things currently stand, we've talked about it before on the show, it seems like Luka Doncic is having as much fun as he ever has in his career playing alongside Kyrie Irving. And we're going to sort of dive into that dynamic a little more down the stretch of the show, but I want to sort of fixate here on the defense and the job that these role players played in the Mavericks being able to pull away with this. Like I mentioned, Derrick Jones Jr., PJ Washington, those were the main two that were guarding the likes of James Harden and Paul George for the Clippers, and they just did a terrific job. George and Harden both dropped 33 points in their Game 4 victory on Wednesday night. They combined for just 22 points. George was 4 of 13 from the field. Harden was 2 of 12. It was a bad game for them. And yes, I understand reputations are definitely a part of the conversation for them, but I don't think you can chalk it up just to, eventually they're going to, choke in the playoffs. Something has to occur in order for that to happen, and I thought it was the defensive efforts by the Mavericks players in order to make that happen. And it's funny when looking at the Mavericks because they still might not have the perfect option from that small forward, that 3 spot, but I do think that Jason Kidd, for as much as it felt like he was on the hot seat for a little bit there during the regular season and he's had some people upset with him, I think that he's done a really good job down the stretch of this year to sort of toy with their different options. And keep in mind, they're without Tim Hardaway Jr. right now, who wasn't really playing as much towards the end of the season anyways, but he ended up spraining his ankle earlier in the playoffs this series. But finding a way to get production out of that 3 spot, Derrick Jones Jr., who I just praised his defense, he actually scored 12 points as well on the offensive side of the ball to help contribute for them. Josh Green, I was sort of upset with Kidd myself early in the series when they weren't playing him as much, but it seems like he's sort of earning his minutes a little bit more. Again, I feel like the 3-and-D ability from him, the intensity that he brings, sort of the young legs that he can provide to help run the court, help play defense, and lock in on a consistent basis, even though the offensive consistency isn't always there. And the resurgence of Dante Exum, who hasn't been a massive factor in this series, but I still feel like on, any given moment, offensively, he can sort of showcase some real stuff for them and be a little bit of a creator is maybe a lot, but I do think that he can sort of initiate some offense in limited sequences. And, he's been a really fun story after being out of the NBA from being a lottery pick in the mid-2010s and really bouncing around. But now here he is, finally healthy and, playing a role in this team. And that same sort of versatility at the 3 spot, I feel like they have with the big man position as well, where Gafford has been the regular starter for them since they traded for him at the All-Star break, but they definitely play around with the minutes of that rotation of big men that they have with Gafford, Maxi Kleber, and Derek Lively. And I found it really interesting that they were running a lot of those double big lineups last night. The key to it really was the fact that Kleber has been a massive impact player for them. It looked like he was unplayable in Game 1, but since then, he has done a really important job for them. He's closed some of these closer games, and it's because of the fact that he's been shooting really well. He provides that spacing. He is 9 of 12 from 3 since that pretty dreadful Game 1 performance. He has been able to, like I said, spread the floor for them. He hasn't been taken advantage of defensively, and they use him sort of as the four, a bigger four, granted, maybe a little bit more old school, but still with the modern day spacing that makes it worth, because we know that Lively and Gafford don't necessarily have the outside shot, but they're both, rim runners and can potentially get stuff on the inside for them, so it's sort of perplexing for opposing defenses. And, if you look at Cleaning the Glass, which is a website that has a lot of really helpful stats, if you look at their lineups during the postseason so far, their most successful lineups have been with Luka, Kyrie, Derrick Jones Jr., Maxi Kleber, and either Gafford or Lively in terms of lineups that have gotten at least 10 possessions. The net rating has been the highest with those double big lineups, which is really interesting to see. A lot of those minutes coming off of last night's game as well, where obviously the Mavericks ran away with it. So the sample size is still pretty small, but they may have discovered something there. And I feel like part of the reason why this is working so well is because you look at the other side with the Clippers, and I'm going to have to sort of look more into this, especially as the series progresses on, and what the Mavericks are going to do long term if they do advance out of the first round, is the fact that they can get away with not having their bigs necessarily being exposed along the perimeter as much, because of the fact that at least last night it seemed like a lot of those minutes were coming with Russell Westbrook on the floor for the Clippers, where you have to love and appreciate Westbrook for the career that he's had, and he was excellent in Game 1. If you remember back to the playoffs last year when they were playing the Suns, some of the effort levels he was giving, especially defensively, he was a big-time impact player, but at the same time, when he's not the initiator, it's really tough for him offensively because of the fact that he just can't shoot, and because of that, Kleber is able to sort of play off of him, sit back in the paint, instead of necessarily having a situation where him and whatever other big they have out there, be it Gafford or Lively, they're not being consistently put into guarding these perimeter players, and it just doesn't really seem like... I would definitely wouldn't say that Westbrook is unplayable, but at the same time, he's 6 of 35 since Game 1, from the field, that is, and it's just really tough for Westbrook. It's sort of hard to see, and that every single possession he's going to give is 100%, but it's just, again, it's tough when he's playing off ball offensively, because what does he really do? And that's still something that you can see him sort of adjusting to in these recent years. Now, I'm sort of curious what his answer would be to that type of question of how does he think that he can impact a game. And you know what? He gets, in some of these instances, I feel like we've seen a lot this year, when you sort of sag off of one of these big-time athletes. Zion is the one that really comes to mind for me, but when you play off of them so much, you let them ramp up and drive, and finishing at the rim just hasn't been there for Westbrook. Obviously, that is sort of the instance where it seems like he would be able to get his, and maybe it's more about cutting off ball on his other teammates' drives, but it just has not been pretty for him in this series. And like I was talking about, the other stepping up is something I really wanted to highlight for the Mavericks in this situation, but at the same time, this game resulted the way that it did because of Luka Doncic, and everybody else that stepped up was just sort of icing on the cake, because I thought that Luka was great in this game, specifically on the offensive side. He talked about the fact that he felt like he was letting down Kyrie Irving. This was after Game 4 in the post-game press conference. He said that he needed to help Kyrie out more, and that is what he did last night, even though he went into it with that knee soreness. I believe it was his right knee. Heard a report that he was also feeling a little bit sick as well, but ends up dropping 35 points and 10 assists. And I thought that this was a really fun version of Luka Doncic, where instead of this slow-paced sort of they walk it up and Luka gets a pick and he sort of runs a two-man game and he has to dictate everything in the half court and it just feels a little bit repetitive, seemed like the Mavericks as a whole were looking to run with more pace in this game, going up and down the court. And Luka was still dictating a lot, but he was doing so in just a much more entertaining version, at least in my eyes, where it was putting, all of his talents. We know that he can drive. We know he can pass. We know he can shoot, all of these things, even though last night wasn't even his best three-point shooting percentage performance, that is. But he was able to help get everybody involved in doing so in a very intriguing way. Kyrie as well sort of added some of that energy as well. And this was just a much more natural use, I feel like, of some of these incredible skills that Luka has that, again, can just be a little bit repetitive when it's this same sort of half-court look. It feels like he needs to dominate every single possession. That was at least less of the case last night, it felt like, and I had a lot of fun watching it. So, it's going to be something interesting maybe to see going forward here, where this playoffs, I don't know about that necessarily, but you talk about the idea of what is the next level Luka can get to, because he's still on the younger side. I don't believe, maybe he's 25 years old. He is, as I look this up here, exactly 25 years old, just turned that a couple months ago. So when he heads into this offseason, obviously he's dealing with the knee injury right now, and there's really only so much you can do in terms of mid-season, let alone mid-postseason adjustments. But if he can get that knee healthy, maybe he works himself into a little bit better shape. There's been a lot of stories about him improving on his conditioning during this past offseason. If he can come out next year and sort of take his athleticism to the next level, I would love to see this fast-paced Mavericks team, especially with Kyrie Irving as his running mate, having the double bigs of Daniel Gafford and Derek Lively, who are both lob threats. I mean, you saw last night, if you watched the game, the lob that Kyrie threw to Daniel Gafford full court, basically looked off to the corner to draw the defender's attention out there. And then I wouldn't say it was quite a no look, but it was, it was just this little misdirection with his eyes that he ended up getting Gafford at the rim with a lob. And it was just a lot of fun to see, in my opinion. The Mavericks have been one of my favorite teams to watch the whole second half of the season, and last night was sort of the cultivation of all of these different aspects about this team coming together to provide a really fun version of basketball, and the Clippers just weren't able to keep up with it. So Clippers definitely may be in trouble here. TNT had a stat on the broadcast that just under 82% of winners of Game 5 when the series is tied 2-2 end up winning the series. They're now going to be headed back to Dallas. Their next game is on Friday night, so I feel like the Clippers are definitely up against the wall here as things currently stand on ESPN Bet. The Mavericks are 7.5-point favorites, so we'll see how this plays out. Kawhi Leonard was, of course, missing in this game as well. Doesn't seem to be 100%. I feel like he's probably doubtful to come back, but we'll have to see there. But let me know what your thoughts on this series are, and that is all we really have on this segment for now. We are going to be taking our first break of the show now. When we come back on the other side, we're going to be diving into the Celtics and Heat series that wrapped up last night. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the face, yeah. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and you'll be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits some mushy shit. A stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're now moving on to the other game from last night in terms of NBA playoffs from Wednesday night. And we saw the Boston Celtics dismantle the Miami Heat to win the game big, end up closing out the series 4-1, and they are now moving on to the second round, the first team in the Eastern Conference to clinch their spot in the second round. And the Heat really never put up a fight in this one. And obviously, injuries are the number one conversation surrounding the Heat. Missing Jimmy Butler, missing Terry Rozier, Josh Richardson as well. I feel like I always sort of throw him in as this like other tier of player that's missing. But Josh Richardson is a real piece for them. And then on top of all of this, Jaime Jaquez Jr. was ruled out for this game. He left late in game 4 with a hip injury. He wasn't able to come back in this one. So the Celtics really just took it to the Heat in this game, had it in the palm of their hand the whole time. They took a double-digit lead at 3-11 and didn't look back from there. It was Derek White hitting the shot to get them to double digits at that point. He had another big-time first quarter, scored 15, and he has just been massively important for them this season. If I can take a minute to sort of talk about the level of production that he's giving them, because the fact that he now is sort of secure in his role last year was definitely weird with the dynamic that was taking place in Boston, considering the fact that there was a lot of things. White wasn't necessarily a proven veteran up to this point yet, even though we saw the flashes with him. And I thought that he was the third best Celtic on the team last year. But specifically from a coaching standpoint, with Joe Mazzulla, who was sort of thrown into the fire given all of the Ime Udoka drama in the offseason, Mazzulla steps in as a first-time head coach who wasn't expecting to be in the role, and I think that the players sort of knew that as well, at least at the time. I feel like they've grown to respect him a lot more during the course of this season, but at least for last year, it felt like Marcus Smart, who was obviously, the heart and soul of that Celtics team. He was the longest tenured Celtic, basically, period. Longest tenured player. And he actually preceded Brad Stevens when he began in Boston. Stevens was the head coach of the team for a handful of years. Ended up being GM, being promoted to GM a couple years ago, and that was all during the time span that Marcus Smart was a Celtic. So I feel like for Mazzulla, it was very tough for him to sort of confront Marcus Smart like that and sit him in some of these big moments in favor of Derek White. Now, I'm not fully defending it necessarily, and Marcus Smart was obviously still a very impactful player, so it's also not an indictment of Marcus Smart. That's just how I've felt about Derek White. And now that he is definitive in his role, it feels like he has just this level of confidence where he's willing to let it rip more offensively. It's what we've seen at least in the first quarter of these past couple games to help lead a couple blowouts. And now I just feel like he is fully unlocked, and you can make the argument that he was the best Celtic in this series. It was either him or Jason Tatum. I don't really care enough to debate that, but it's a real conversation because that's how good Derek White was in this series. But ultimately, when you look at this game and the series as a whole, Celtics had no excuse to lose. Obviously, with all of the injuries that Miami was dealing with, and they just had no real form of offense other than Bam Adebayo. And I love Bam. I feel like he goes underappreciated by a lot of NBA fans, but his offense isn't really one that can, put a playoff team on its shoulders to duel against one of the best offensive teams in the league in a playoff situation, especially when you don't have the spacing around him. The Heat hit just 3 threes in comparison to the Celtics 16. They didn't really have a chance in this one to that perspective. This was a tough game for Tyler Hero, where, Hero is somebody that I'm really interested in, both sort of going forward as well. I feel like his evaluation is a really tough one because he does provide a level of offense that the Heat definitely need, and it was clear that they were missing him when the rest of their team was healthy and their offense still wasn't great. But the offense at times, and he did showcase some of the playmaking ability that he maybe has. He's still not a traditional point guard, but with a traditional point guard next to him, he can be maybe a little bit of a combo guard. I'm not saying quite as good, but maybe sort of a similar role, downsized a bit, though, to what Devin Booker does for the Suns. But the issue for Tyler Hero in this game was the fact that the Celtics were time after time attacking him defensively, and he wasn't getting any types of stops. Jason Tatum specifically was absolutely loving that matchup, but really it was the whole team that was going in on him, and it was a pretty bad performance from him there. I know that he got a couple easy layups mid-second quarter that does sort of boost up the stats a little bit, but just didn't think it was a good Tyler Hero game. And the Heat's offseason is just going to be very interesting moving forward here, because a lot of basketball fans are arguing that if the Heat had Jimmy Butler, they would easily win this series. I just don't know about that. The Celtics won by 20 points, 14 points, and 34 points in their wins. The series definitely has a different energy to it if Jimmy Butler is available for the Heat, but I still think the Celtics win. Now, maybe the Heat steal another game along the road here, but at least from the perspective of a Celtics fan, if the Heat decided to run it back with the exact same team, both teams fully healthy, I would be on board for that, because I think the Celtics would win. So in terms of looking ahead at their offseason, I'd prefer that they choose not to do all too much, because I just feel like that offense was flawed all season long, and obviously we know that Jimmy Butler doesn't necessarily care about the regular season. We're going to get into that as this segment moves on here, but the Heat were bottom 10 in the league in offensive rating this season. The only time they topped 100 points in this series was when they shot a franchise record 23 of 43 from 3 in Game 2, and they're going to, in my eyes, at least need to address something. Now, again, they never really got the full version of themselves with Rozier, Hero, Butler, Adebayo, of course, and sort of the rest of the group. And it does feel like they have some level of depth, but at the same time, just doesn't feel like that's enough offensively, at least in my eyes. And for their offseason plans, it's going to be interesting considering the fact that Jimmy Butler is eligible for a contract extension. He is reportedly seeking a max extension from the Heat this offseason, according to the Miami Herald. He is hoping to get a $113 million max extension over the next 2 seasons, so we'll see about that. But he's locked in for next season, and then the 2025-26 season, he has a player option that he will likely decline unless anything crazy occurs there. That's assuming he even gets there and they don't work out an extension this offseason. We'll see about all of that. And I think that Butler is going to get that contract extension. Now, there are some points you could make as to why he shouldn't get that type of money. He's going to be 35 years old next season. He hasn't played in 65 or more regular season games since the 2018-19 season. This past season, he had his worst averages in assists, rebounds, and steals since he joined the Heat. His scoring numbers dipped as well from the 2022-23 season. And he seems to almost be celebrated and praised by a lot of NBA fans, at least during the regular season. I feel like now that the Heat are in this sort of position, more fans are turning on him. But it feels like, for a lot of the year at least, it's almost cool that he doesn't care about the regular season or winning any types of awards along those lines. But the Heat have now been 8 seeds in each of the past 2 postseasons, which is just not a recipe for success. They were trailing late in the fourth quarter of the game last year that they played against the Chicago Bulls and almost missed the playoffs altogether. Now, of course, it's a little bit overstated. I feel like I myself have at least said it a bunch of times, but it's just a fact that the team that made the NBA Finals almost didn't even make the playoffs, which is, of course, remarkable the way that they did pull off that run once they made it to the playoffs, but they didn't make it easy for themselves is what I'm saying. And that they didn't make it easy for themselves this year either, where you can't really bank on knocking off the number 1 seed in the first round every single year. That's just not really a recipe for success. And, even when you look at this year, he doesn't care as much about the regular season. He's just focused on the postseason. It's not like he saved himself any sort of injury by not caring about the regular season, because he, of course, freak injury, but he gets injured in the play-in game, an extra game that he wouldn't have had to play if the Heat were able to get the 6th seed or higher, and he ends up missing the playoffs altogether. And I like Jimmy Butler a lot. You have to respect him. His story is absolutely incredible. If you haven't looked into it, you definitely should. It is a great one. And you have to respect the type of player he is, but at the same time, the Heat could use him stepping up more in the regular season, and I would argue it's harming them that he isn't. Now, he's not the sole issue. Again, I feel like there are other things on the roster that need to be improved, and maybe it's just a fact of they need to all be healthy together to actually develop some chemistry, but I'm just not sure. That offense was really broken this regular season, and I'm just not sure that they can sort of flip a switch in the postseason. Jimmy averaged, whatever it was, like 35, 40 points in the first round last year against a Bucks team that, granted, hardly had Giannis in the series, and that's great. And they did ultimately steamroll their way. I wouldn't say steamroll, but made their way to the NBA Finals, but then they're relying on Caleb Martin, who probably hasn't averaged 20 points per game since he was in high school, him doing that in the conference finals. And again, I'm not trying to diminish the Heat by any means, but feel like they sort of are going to have a lot of questions this offseason is really what I am getting at. But I guess and again, I think that the Heat are going to re-sign Jimmy Butler. I just wanted to kind of lay out the cases for some of the concerns that could be surrounding this type of a move, but I think they will do it, and I think they should do it. But kind of last notes here on the game itself. I thought that Al Horford played really well in replacement of Kristaps Porzingis, who of course went down in Game 4 with that calf injury. Porzingis is going to be out for some time, so they were going to have to rely on an older Al Horford. They ended up playing some Luke Cornett minutes as well, who he had sort of fallen out of the rotation. I thought that he did a pretty good job himself. I feel like I'm personally higher on Xavier Tillman as a bench big option, but Cornett did nothing wrong necessarily to prove that he wasn't worthy of those minutes, and they're both fine options off of the bottom of the bench. But it's going to be interesting to see how the Celtics choose to manage Al Horford's minutes, considering the fact that he is 37 years old. He is 38 at the beginning of June, so if they were to make it to the NBA Finals, he's going to be 38 by then. He has a lot of miles under his sort of career here, especially in the playoffs the past few years. The Celtics have been very reliant on him, and they put up a stat, I think it was either last night or it was during Game 4, but Al Horford now has the second most playoff games played from any active NBA player, only behind LeBron James. So that's sort of all I have on the Game 5. Quickly here, for the Celtics moving forward, a lot of Celtics fans are taking some victory laps over this series, and I get it. This has been a pretty contentious rivalry, even though at times both sides of the rivalry, at least on Twitter, and Twitter is obviously a nightmare, but you have people sort of denying that it is a rivalry, but it is. They've met in 4 of the last 5 playoffs, met in the Eastern Conference Finals 3 times. The Heat fans were chanting, "We want Boston," during their play-in win over the Chicago Bulls. But for the Celtics here, things only really could have gone wrong for them, and some Celtics fans will be upset with that, but that's the reality when your expectations are as high as they are. It's almost a privilege to not be able to celebrate a first round series. And you can be happy about it, absolutely, especially when it comes to beating the Miami Heat because of this rivalry. But I feel like a lot of Celtics fans are sort of getting ahead of themselves, saying that Mazzulla outcoached Eric Spoelstra. I'm not willing to go that far. The talent discrepancy has always sort of been in favor of the Celtics, but it's never been a margin wider than it was during this postseason. And I just feel like I'm not ready to say that Mazzulla did a better job than Eric Spoelstra. I just feel like a message to my fellow Celtics fans: enjoy the series win. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, but we can enjoy it. It's fun to beat the Heat, but at the same time, there are bigger things at stake here. And on that note, for the Celtics moving forward, we talked about it briefly here. Kristaps Porzingis may miss the entire second round. We don't know who they're going to be playing yet. Cavs Magic Game 6 is on Friday night. If the Cavs win that one, the Celtics will play them on Sunday. If the Magic win and this goes to 7, the Celtics will play the winner of that on Tuesday. Celtics probably would like the other Eastern Conference series to go as long as possible to give Porzingis the maximum amount of time. But I do think that the Celtics can beat either Orlando or Cleveland without Porzingis. I do think that the matchup against Cleveland is a little more interesting with the two bigs that there are there. That size might be a little bit of an issue, but I would still take the Celtics in that series. And then finally here, Tatum didn't have the most outstanding series, and he's one of the less popular NBA stars when it comes to, at least on Twitter, and a lot of people are sort of looking at his shooting splits of 42-29 and acting like it was this terrible performance from him. The Heat were throwing everything they could defensively at Tatum, and I thought it was interesting. There's this clip that's sort of circulating that in December, Jason Tatum went on Andre Iguodala's podcast, Point Forward, and Iguodala talked about during his couple seasons that he spent with Miami, it was in 2019, 20, around those years, that the Heat have a very in-depth game plan for Jason Tatum specifically. He referred to it as the Tatum rules, similar to the Pistons Jordan rules. Those were his words, not mine. Don't get mad at me for trying to make some sort of comparison that I'm not. That the Heat studied Tatum's habits down to some of these small details of what he does after 3 dribbles, or what he likes to do when the shot clock is at 15 seconds or 7 seconds. And they have really just sort of poured themselves into stop Jason Tatum, figure out the rest. And I just think that even though the personnel for some of these other teams is going to be better as the playoffs progress here, from a game plan standpoint, the Heat sort of know what to do in order to slow down Jason Tatum, and I thought that they did so, but I think that Tatum's only going to get more efficient from here. We'll see how it goes. That's at least my prediction as things currently stand, but we will have to see about that. But that is all I have on this series. We're now going to be taking our second break of the show, and when we come back, I want to switch gears a little bit to the NFL, and I specifically want to talk about the NFC North and the draft that they had over last weekend. So stick with us. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're now going to be moving on to some NFL talk, and I wanted to talk about the NFC North and the NFL draft that they had, where we saw a really, busy offseason from the NFC this past year. Started with free agency. The Packers went out and were impactful, bringing in Josh Jacobs and Xavier McKinney were really the big names. But I feel like the drama here only got more intense with the way that the NFL draft played out. So I wanted to give some thoughts on it. The Bears were really the team that had the most spotlight surrounding them because of the fact that they had the number 1 overall pick, which they obviously used on Caleb Williams. That was a no-brainer. Number 9, they also had, that was their own actual pick. Number 1 was from Carolina, so they held number 9 as well. It was interesting what they were going to choose to do in terms of there was the possibility they could go with an offensive lineman to help out Caleb Williams in this situation. Specifically, there was the detail that Caleb was actually teammates with offensive tackle Olu Fashanu in high school. He sort of alluded to the fact that he would be interested in playing with Fashanu, but instead they decided to go with Rome Odunze, who I love as a prospect, and I do think that this makes a lot of sense. They did just add Keenan Allen in the offseason, but it's likely going to be a one-season rental for him. He is somebody who's also dealt with injuries in the past, even though I thought that he had his best NFL season of his career this past year. So definitely going to be an impactful player for them there. DJ Moore's under contract for the next 2 seasons. Then he's going to be a free agent. They're going to have a decision to make. So as long as Odunze pans out for them, this move ensures that Caleb is going to have a solidified receiver 1 for at least the first 5 years of his career with the Bears, probably longer. And it's just a great job of them building around a quarterback after, of course, there was so much sort of mismanagement with the Justin Fields situation when they took him in 2021. The Bears actually did add an offensive lineman in the 3rd round. They took Karan Amegaji, who is an offensive tackle out of Yale, who definitely has potential. One of the better round 3 picks in my eyes. He took over Yale's left tackle spot his junior season, and he probably won't be the week 1 starter for Chicago, but it is at least maybe an answer in the long term. Maybe they choose to address it in next year's draft, but general manager Ryan Poles said that he has belief in Braxton Jones, who was a 5th round pick, I believe, in 2022. Definitely correct me if I'm wrong on that. But Amegaji has a chance to, earn his spot in training camp. He's going to be competing for it. We'll see if that necessarily works out. But they address the offense with the first 3 picks of the draft, which is exactly what they needed to do in my eyes. Definitely put Caleb in a better situation than they put Justin Fields in during his first few seasons. And I do think that they have some legitimate playoff potential for next season. They won 7 games last year. Caleb Williams is one of the highest graded prospects in recent history and has a ton of weapons around him. I've talked about this before. If Caleb Williams is the player that a lot of draft experts say that he is, I think there's a chance he can have a similar rookie season to what CJ Stroud did last year. Now, CJ Stroud, I know that bar is extremely high, of course, but Caleb has more weapons around him, I believe, and I like the Houston situation as well, but Caleb Williams has all the talent in the world around him. Already talked about the receivers, but they have a very deep running back room as well. They just signed DeAndre Swift. They also have a couple other guys in that room, like Roshan Johnson and Khalil Herbert, who can be effective players for them as well. But down the stretch of last season, the Bears were 5-3, in large part thanks to their defense really coming into their own. And part of that was due to the fact that they got a legitimate edge rusher when they traded for Montez Sweat at the trade deadline, gave up a valuable second-round pick, but ultimately showed that it is a potentially very, very good move for them. It seems to at least be good, and they ended up paying him a ton of money, but the production was absolutely there, and it seems like he could be a cornerstone for them moving forward. The defense allowed 20 points or less in 7 of their final 8 games. Matt Eberflus, their head coach, has a background in defense, and I sort of like the stories that have come out about him in terms of being inspiring and having his guys play for him. And now he's getting some real playmakers on that side, like I mentioned, Montez Sweat, but the development of some of their key young pieces in the secondary, Tyreek Stevenson, Kyler Gordon, Jaquan Brisker. They obviously just re-signed Jalen Johnson to a new long-term extension. So the Bears are going to be, in my eyes, a competitive team, and they were the worst team out of the NFC North last year. Now, the other team that is probably a little bit more questionable is the Minnesota Vikings. Specifically, it comes down to how NFL ready is J.J. McCarthy going to be, is what it sort of bakes down to. But he's also going to, have some weapons. I feel like that defense is also pretty talented. They went out and spent big in free agency. They brought in some edge rushers and Jonathan Grenard, Andrew Van Ginkel. They brought in Blake Cashman as well to help as a linebacker. They were able to sort of steal Dallas Turner later in the first round. Seemed like he could have been a top 10 pick. He ends up going 17 to them later on. And this was a defense last year that Brian Flores blitzed more than anybody else. And now, ideally, they have some personnel in that front seven that can sort of generate some pressure without having to send a full blitz. So that's at least on the defensive side of the ball, the questions there. On offense, we'll see if McCarthy is even the day one starter. He's going to be competing with Sam Darnold for that starting quarterback position. But around them, it's the top 2 receivers, of course, in Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison that are going to make life easy for any quarterback. TJ Hawkinson, also one of the top pass-catching tight ends in the league. And their run game has been very subpar for the past couple years. And now they went out and signed Aaron Jones, who I do think is one of the upper-tier running backs in the NFL. So definitely could be a friendly situation for whoever's there at quarterback. I would imagine that the Vikings are probably going to finish last in the NFC North, but I also love their head coach as well in terms of the offensive mind of Kevin O'Connell, and I think that he can do a lot of good stuff for J.J. McCarthy. I feel like this was a really good landing spot for him. Again, a little unknown as to when he will play, but Vikings can definitely be competitive. And then the top 2 teams in the NFC from last year both made it to the second round or beyond. In the playoffs is the Green Bay Packers and the Detroit Lions. I thought the Packers had an A offseason. I thought they did pretty much everything they needed to do. Started with addressing, not that there were that many holes on the roster necessarily, but they did get to address the secondary a little bit, bringing in Xavier McKinney, who is definitely an upgrade for them. Now, hopefully they can actually get a healthy season of Jair Alexander, who has been very on and off the field for them, but just continuing to sort of develop as a young team, I feel like is the number one thing for them. It's not that they aren't talented or anything, they just are very inexperienced, and that goes to, the conversation surrounding Jordan Love, but also the plethora of receivers that he was throwing to that are all on rookie contracts: Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, and his top 2 tight end targets as well, and Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft, I believe, were both draft picks in 2023. So, this is a team that I don't know if I'm ready to go, Super Bowl contender yet necessarily, but they are continuing to develop with one another. They spend their first round pick on Jordan Morgan, offensive tackle out of Arizona. To be honest, I don't know tons about him necessarily, but fully understand the idea of trying to go out and, give your franchise quarterback some extra help. And then I thought the fact that they were able to get the number one linebacker off of the board in the third round, I believe it was, when they got Edgerrin Cooper, linebacker out of Texas A&M, was definitely a positive for them as well. Now, hopefully they see some more production from Lucas Van Ness, who was their first round pick last year, and they could, really get cooking there again, where I just feel like the Packers have drafted very well, and obviously, Aaron Rodgers would tell you differently because it wasn't exactly addressing the needs that Rodgers preferred, but they have built up so much young talent on this Packers team that I'm not necessarily ready to say that, they're Super Bowl bound, but I definitely can't rule them out by any means. I mean, I thought that they outplayed the 49ers in that divisional round matchup until they sort of fell apart at the end there, and that was definitely seemed like a learning moment for Jordan Love and the rest of that team, but they have just about all of the pieces that they could really use to get back to a similar position, if not better, and I am definitely very high on the Packers. And then finally, the Lions. I loved what they did in the secondary in the draft this year. The secondary was really the number one concern with them. They go out and they get a couple very promising cornerbacks in Terrion Arnold out of Alabama, and then it was in the third round, I believe, it might have been the second round, but they end up getting Ennis Rakestraw Jr., another very physical cornerback who maybe a little too physical, might take him a little bit to adjust to the NFL, but definitely a very promising cornerback. And the Lions are a team that they also, as much as I said that it's the Packers that should have came out of that NFC or that game against the 49ers, you can say the same thing about the Lions as well, who are a very promising team, should continue to be. I think coming into the season next year, they have to be a top 2 team in the NFC. I kind of think it's them and the 49ers really, and then you can have a conversation from there. But even still, it's a wide open conference, and the NFC North is going to be really interesting to me. I think they're going to have 3 playoff teams would be, my guess. Granted, we're at the beginning of May, so way too early to sort of fully dive into those things, but as long as Caleb Williams can be an NFL ready player and produce for them, I have a little bit of a hard time to rule them out of making the playoffs next year. I think the Packers and the Lions should be shoo-ins as long as they're fully healthy as well. And I'm really excited to watch this division sort of take over the conference for years to come because of the young quarterback play. You look at the NFC and it doesn't seem like there's necessarily all too many young quarterbacks. It feels like the AFC has sort of been the quarterback renaissance. Obviously, Mahomes, Burrow, Allen, throw in Justin Herbert, Trevor Lawrence, all of those. But in the NFC now, you have Jordan Love and potentially Caleb Williams and potentially J.J. McCarthy. And this feels like the division that has, already competitive for this upcoming season potential, but potential for years to come as well. And I'm definitely looking forward to see how this all plays out. I think there's going to be a ton of storylines coming out of the NFC North. But let us know what you feel on the NFC North, what your predictions are, really in the conference as a whole. But we are going to be taking our final break of the show now, and when we come back on the other end, we're going to be continuing to dive into some NFL talks. I want to touch on the updates surrounding the T. Higgins and Brandon Ayuk situations, so stick with us, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC. To to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're headed into our final segment of the day, and I wanted to touch on some NFL stories surrounding T. Higgins and Brandon Ayuk and where things currently stand with them. We have some recent updates on the T. Higgins situation where it was reported that he was looking for a contract similar to what Michael Pittman got during the offseason. He was franchise tagged and was given an extension for about $20 million a year. And that's what Higgins was hoping for, but supposedly the number that the Bengals threw out there was nowhere close to that, and the two just do not see eye to eye. He requested a trade a handful of weeks ago. He is sort of doubled down on it, and I think that the conversation is really interesting with him. He's actually not the only one that has requested a trade out of Cincinnati. Trey Hendrickson as well, defensive end, reportedly wants out as well. So the Bengals are sort of just holding this thing together right now. And I do feel like that is probably the way that this plays out. Now, it would hurt them if either of these players were to try and go on some sort of a holdout. I feel like it would actually be more impactful if Trey Hendrickson did. But in terms of T. Higgins and his future with Cincinnati and in the NFL, I don't know if he can I feel like in general, holdouts during the prime years of your career can be very harmful. You know, I'm definitely pro player over, pro franchises, but I feel like it is a difficult situation to try and necessarily hold out, especially if you are in the position of Higgins, who just had a down year last season, career lows in just about every statistical category, partially in due to the fact that he himself was dealing with injuries and his quarterback Joe Burrow was as well, so there was a lot of inconsistency there. But just in terms of sort of where things stand with Higgins, I thought if he weren't going to, and this does sort of stand for Brandon Ayuk as well, if he wasn't going to get traded during the NFL draft, I have a hard time thinking that he's going to be traded in general. Player for player NFL trades sort of rarely, work out, or rarely happen, period. Not just, work out necessarily. But I think that for the Bengals, they feel like they are going to be competitive to win the AFC and win the Super Bowl this year. And they are going to do everything they can to sort of push their chips into this year before Joe Burrow's contract ends up skyrocketing. I think that this is possibly his 5th year option that he's coming up on right now. I'll have to sort of double check what the exact details of his contract are looking like. But obviously the extension is coming in very soon, if not it's already kicking in this season. And so it's going to start to take off. I believe this is his 5th year option, and then it's going to jump, his cap hit is going to jump over $46 million for the next handful of years. So the Bengals are trying to capitalize on the opportunity they have this year, and unless they can find a move for T. Higgins that is going to get them value in return that can help them compete this season, I just don't see a way that they ultimately make this move. And that sort of goes for Brandon Ayuk as well, who Ayuk has not publicly requested a trade, but has done all of the sort of, online stirring the pot moves of commenting on. It was John Lynch, I think, made a comment about wanting to have Brandon Ayuk for the long-term future, and Ayuk posted a series of emojis that was something like money talks, and all of that. The 49ers situation is very interesting. I'm not sure if I've fully touched on it since the draft, but they went and they selected Ricky Pearsall out of Florida, in the first round. This was a little bit of a surprising move, but considering the fact that in terms of guarantees, Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk could both be gone by the start of the 2025 season, I do think that this makes sense for them. I think that Ayuk Pearsall is an incredible player, and I think that he's going to have a lot of success in the NFL. I really wanted the Patriots to go and draft him, so I feel like into a Shanahan offense, Pearsall is definitely going to be a threat. When you look at the Cincinnati situation in terms of how they handled the draft and what impact it could have, they drafted a couple weapons, specifically Jermaine Burton in the third round could be interesting. I believe he was the former Bulldog turned Crimson Tide, and he was definitely a deep threat that was very valuable last season for the play of Alabama, where Jalen Milroe, who I'm definitely not out on as a prospect, but he seems limited, to say the least, in terms of how he performed last season. And it seemed like at a certain point when they started hitting their stride, it was, okay, we have Burton, we're going to send him deep because he is more athletic than the majority of opposing cornerbacks, and he's either going to make a play or they are and Milroe, keep in mind, obviously, accuracy and over the middle, all of those can still be concerns for them at times. Arm strength is not a concern for Milroe, so it was let it rip and let Burton make a play. If he doesn't catch it, he might draw a flag, all of those types of ideologies, and he was an effective player, and I feel like he's going to be a nice little... I don't think that he's necessarily wide receiver one, but I feel like he can turn into sort of a similar version of what T. Higgins was playing off of Jamar Chase, because Chase isn't eligible for his contract extension until next offseason, but I would imagine that that is going to be the priority for them, and they're probably going to, double down on him as their wide receiver one for the future, which makes total sense to me. But Burton can sort of slide into that role in terms of, being that complementary piece. And I understand it doesn't feel great to let a player with the talent of T. Higgins just walk, but at the same time, I just don't feel like the Bengals can afford paying Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase all the money that they're going to be guaranteed, and then throwing in a third receiver in T. Higgins, who I do like, and I think that he can be a wide receiver one, but I don't think he's ever going to be one of those upper echelon wide receiver ones. And for them, I feel like they're just better off sort of playing out this season, and if he walks, so be it. But he gives them a much better chance to compete in the Super Bowl this upcoming season. And Ayuk, I feel like the outlook with them long term is a little bit different, because Deebo Samuel is, I would say, the better wide receiver. When Deebo is fully healthy, in terms of the versatility that he can provide, it's really hard to pick a skill position player who can do more than Deebo Samuel, but he's on the older side. Injuries are a massive concern with him, and if they have an out in the contract after next season, they're going to have to be dishing out a likely lucrative contract to Brock Purdy, who, after playing all these years on his rookie contract, I don't think that he is going to try and, go on the cheaper side, the team-friendly deal. I think he's going to try and get his, which he absolutely deserves. Now, that's a whole other conversation if you feel like they should be paying Purdy or they shouldn't, but ultimately, when it comes to the conversation around which wide receiver to stick with, I kind of feel like I would lean with Brandon Ayuk. I just think that the level of production he's been able to put up while being the wide receiver too, and he's probably more of the third option, because I think that Christian McCaffrey is probably more considered the first or second option than Ayuk is. But to have the season that he did last year, 1,300 yards, 75 receptions on option 2, at least wide receiver 2, possibly option 3 types of looks, I feel like he has a super high ceiling. He's really come along. He's gotten better year after year, and I would definitely lean with sticking with him in the long term. If you can keep Deebo Samuel as well, I mean, Deebo is, again, I can't get over how much I enjoy watching him as a player, but just from a franchise building standpoint, I think that Ayuk gives you the sort of longer term success, and they can probably work out a trade because he's not an official free agent after next season. It's just that it's not guaranteed after there, and he's probably going to want a deal that includes guaranteed money for himself. So if they could probably work out some sort of a trade there in my eyes and get a little bit of value for him as well. Now, how much value, we'll see. It doesn't really matter. Again, I'm just talking a little bit hypothetical here, but it is definitely going to be interesting to see how they weigh their options as things progress here. I don't think that sort of to wrap this all up, T. Higgins and Brandon Ayuk, I expect them to both be on their teams headed into next season. I just feel like the windows for them, they're trying to win now. They have expensive quarterback contracts on the horizon, so they're going to try and push their chips in for this season. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, but there's still plenty of other talent on the roster. I think that for the 49ers, it becomes an interesting conversation as to who they choose to stick with, but definitely let me know in the comment section how you feel about that situation. But that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning in to the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Check us out on socials for more exclusive short content. And we host the show live every 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Definitely be sure to tune in tomorrow. Take care, and we will see you then.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.